What's going on, beautiful people? Welcome to an edition of J4 Conversations. I am AJ, your moderator. For purposes relative to this conversation, I'm a biracial cat born to a French European mother out of France and to a Creole black father out of New Orleans by way of Gary, Indiana. At 16 years old, y'all, I decided to get out of the proverbial gray of biraciality. I was existed among a small percentage of human beings at that particular point, and I decided to land in a cultural home to remove myself from the proverbial gray and to land in a blackness. I was 16 years old, and that was further emphasized and iterated for me in the space of college. But at 54, y'all, I discovered a new emerging group of young people, beautiful young folks, biracial themselves, who, for whatever reasons and pathways and circumstances, were choosing to explore a reclamation, a sort of reclaiming of their own identity to understand that there had been an historical cultural home within a blackness, but they're seeking to explore and assert a new identity that is namedly a biracial identity. And I have to admit, y'all, I didn't know. At 16, I was biracial, black identifying, and at 54, I discovered there's a community of young folks in this biracial space who are asking profound, insightful kinds of questions, who are rejecting some of the identity formation of old. And it was fascinating to me. It's absolutely fascinating to me, to the point to where I said, what would it even take for a biracial identity to assert itself not just as a racial category, but also as a culture? And so, what you're looking at is sort of my musings around biracial identity formation, of which I came up with 9 criteria that I thought would need to be in place for the question to even be legitimate, for the question to even make sense, at least in my mind. And so let me state up front that this is my musings. These are my speculations as a biracial dude that's been on the planet 5 decades, who went through my own formation and who at a time was not aware of even an option for in a biracial community beyond just friend circles that we had within our sort of immediate environment. The fact that some 30, 40 some years later, beautiful young people are asking these questions, it fascinates me. And so I came up with these 9 criteria. And what I want to process with you all today is growth. All right. It's growth. In order to become a distinctive culture, at some point, you're going to have mass. All right. Right now, about 10% of Americans identify as 2 or more races across all age sets. But how do you determine whether or not that number is going to grow? Well, you look at marriage patterns, and the trajectory of future babies is determined by current relationships. If you look at all newlyweds, and that's just newlyweds, it's not talking about single parent dynamics or having a child out of marriage. But if you look at newlyweds in 2015, 17% of all newlyweds were interracial. And that is compared to 10% of current marriages. But if you look at just those who married newlyweds, that's 17%. And that 17% is having babies, and that is sort of suggesting growth. And so let me kind of go to the data set. We'll talk about that. The This is from the Pew Research. The information is inside the description in terms of the where the article came from. But if you look at the demographics, 18 years and older, that's so-called considered independent and so-called adulthood. But if you look at of those who were biracial, 2 or more races, if you look at black-white configuration, 18% of those who were biracial, multiracial, multi-generationally mixed, whatever the case may be, 18% were white and black. All right. However, if you look at if you look at this from 2013, but if you look at under the age of 1, an indicator of the birth rate, the number triples, the number doubles. It goes from 18% as an aggregate of the entire multiracial biracial population. But if you look at it In the same time set, and you extrapolate it by age, those babies under one who are biracial or multiracial, black white configuration is 36%, y'all. 36%. So that would suggest that more and more biracial babies are being born, and they're going to continue to affect the population statistical demographics. And it is something, in my mind, is probably foreshadowing a tipping point to where we really need to understand the emergence of this community, and how do we prepare to adequately understand the community and the uniqueness that is connected to them. So, if you look at, to get a glimpse of America's racial demographics are changing, today, look at the difference between mixed race Americans, old and young. The racial background of the largest group of multiracial babies, 36%, is black and white, compared to 18% of adults with the same configuration. I just want to pause there a brief moment to say the largest group of multiracial babies. Right now, the largest group is not black white mix. However, for whatever circumstances, whatever's going on in the society, this has a lot of implications, y'all, in terms of intra-group kind of dynamics among black folk. But the largest emerging group of biracial babies are black and white. Let me restate. Black white mix is not the largest right now. It's not the largest, but if you look at trajectory, upward trends, if you foreshadow, you look at infants, you look at those who are recently born, 36% of biracial black white kids are biracially black and white, which is significantly more than the current aggregate of black white human beings that exist here in the United States of America. This is the largest group. This is going to have implications in terms of culture and how we negotiate, navigate, and see ourselves, and how we sort of kind of move forward as a community at a crossroads. In some instances, you may not feel it in your personal space, but as I'm in these YouTube streets looking at the dialogue around biracial identity, we're sort of at an historical crossroads, and many people are asserting themselves in different kinds of ways. And as I've said many a times, I believe we are in a sociological and anthropological immersion of something new. I don't know if it'll evolve to become its own distinct culture with traditions and days of celebrations and four-ways and ways of moving throughout the world. But I do know it's going to assert itself politically. It's going to assert itself in terms of academics, and it's going to assert itself in perhaps in a tenuous way with the historical mother cultural home of blackness. So let's talk about what are some of the possible implications of this. And so this is what I want to focus on for the bulk of the conversation. And today's not going to be too long. I see a couple folks in here. If you have some questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Or if you have some things you want to share or process, feel free to do that as well. But as we talk about the 9 criteria between an importance of scholarship and increased visibility, a growing tense relationship to the historical cultural home, and the fact that the numbers are just going to continue to grow, to swell. At some point, you're going to have to recognize the emergence of a biracial identity in a way that is thoughtful, in a way that is reflective, in a way that is seeking harmony, in a way that is seeking sort of congruency between the two historical community and cultures, and that is managed both at an institutional level, but also critically important at a familia level, at a family kind of level. So just to kind of illustrate, the one thing is, if you are a trend watcher, if you're wanting to look at new communities and emerging markets, this is a time to sort of think about what are going to be the unique needs of biracial communities, what are going to be the unique wants of biracial communities, what are going to be the possible trends and aspirations that might emerge out of this group. If you're a futuristic thinker, the data suggests that, hey, in 5-10 years from now, you're going to have not only in America just a browning of America and a voluminous representation of 2 or more races, but you're going to have a specifically growing community of black, white kinds of um, family structures represented in their children. What's the market on? What's the marketing opportunity there to take advantage of that if you want to sort of be capitalistically centered? So we got Telling Stewart, Jury Nullification. How you doing, sister? Good to see you. Thank you so much for dropping by. Appreciate you so much. I'm just chopping it up with the fact that 36% of babies under the age of 1 are black and white, compared to 18% of that total representation. And they are now the largest configuration of heritage makeup, black and white. That hadn't always been the historical case. The historical case had largely been American Indian and white, followed by Asian and white. But now going forward, the largest configuration of family structure and represented in their children is going to be black, white, biracial children. So there's a new market out there, y'all. There's a new community of people that will begin to sort of, I think of themselves differently. They'll begin to create community, out of commonality, common experiences, common testimony comes community. And the precursor to culture is community, and community is the outcome of commonality. And technology, particularly YouTube and social media, has allowed people, regardless of geography, to come together and to share their stories. And as they share their stories, they're conveying commonality. They're conveying empathy with each other. They're conveying connectedness to each other. And out of that comes community. Right now, as I'm observing it, it largely seems to be within the technological space, but at some point it'll become more physical. It'll become more geographical, where people are interacting with each other, and out of that is a formula for cultural immersion. And so there's many young folks out here who are sort of asking these questions, and certainly are creating communities among themselves. And inevitably, the next step is some distinction. I hope it's not in a way that completely extracts itself from a maternal blackness, but either way, the numbers are simply suggesting that the emergence of a distinct biracial articulation, representation, commonality, community is already in its infancy. And as more and more biracial children, particularly black, white biracial children, are being birthed, the numbers are just going to warrant this community component, this emerging community kind of collective. Hey, Magic Mulata, how are you? Good to see you. Appreciate you coming through. We're just chopping it up about the 9 criteria indirectly. One of them is growth. And how do you determine growth of a biracial community? Well, that's based upon childbirth. If you look at 1%, babies under the age of 1 that are black, white configuration, 36%. They represent 36% compared to black, white as an aggregate of the larger U.S. population at 18%. Black and white is the largest growing community of biracial kids now, and that is sort of lining up with this new emerging scene within the biracial space. So right now I'm just talking about what are some of those implications. If y'all have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Excuse my dog barking. The Magic Mulata says, wow. Okay. So there's an emerging market. So if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a hustler, if you are a forward, futuristic thinking individual, the demographics are changing. Is there a way you can get ahead of the curve and bring some value to the community, bring some product, bring some way of thinking, some way of analyzing and understanding the emerging community, and to think that out? What does that mean politically? What does that mean economically? What does that mean in a host of different variables? And how can you sort of be a part of this beginning stages of culture and community of various forms? The second piece is expansion of Black studies. This is an opportunity now to formally recognize the emerging community of black, white babies who in large part probably acknowledge and love both love sources in their mama and daddy, which is a distinction from my era. We tended to silence our white mother's voice and uplifted our black father's voice. Don't apologize for that. That was consistent with our time. But today, young people are saying, no, I got equal love and equal representation for mama and or daddy. The same thing now should apply to our academics. I would say the expansion of Black studies to add to, excuse me, because in many ways they may be doing some of this work already, where they're examining all the different themes and subject matter and current events and hot topics as they relate to the Black monolithic or the Black diaspora, or a Black collective that's not dissected and talked about with great detail, other than the theory and study and the research that's being done. But the immersion of more classes, more PhDs, more faculty lines that are specifically dealing with biracial kinds of subject matter and studies. I'd like to see that become a part of the Black Studies home versus its own independent college and or school and or curriculum. Right now, and this is maybe generational. I certainly wouldn't want to separate the two. I would just simply like the conversation to be more robust, more acknowledging, and more sophisticated in recognizing that the population is just growing. In 1970, the earliest data set I saw of biracial people was 1% of the larger population. Now it's 10%. If you look at the age under one, you're just seeing almost 1 in 3 babies are being are biracial. And so how can our Black Studies program become more sophisticated, more inclusive, and more sort of foreshadowing the changing demographic within Blackness, to include conversations, robust dialogues about the opportunities and the threats going forward as a beautiful cultural community. All right, so let me pause there. What kind of culture should we create for ourselves? Like, what are values as a mulatto community? Huh? I don't know, mulatto. I think the community is at a formulation phase right now, which is basically um, reactionary, reactionary to real and perceived injustice, to a monoracial community, both maybe in family or extended family structures, maybe in activist work where you found yourself in Black circles wanting to advocate, but maybe you met some resistance there. Perhaps there's been some tension in various kind of communities. So right now, the community is reactionary. It's sort of thinking about itself, who it is, and there's friendly community conversations going on. Inevitably, there's elements of tension and beef that'll come into that. So I think at this point, it's almost a little mature, early, excuse me, premature to think about values. And I think a healthy first step for any cultural community or any group seeking to understand itself is to gather, is to gather, and to gather with structure, right? I'd recommend the first thing is that, is there interest? Is there an appeal to simply come together? It doesn't have to be a celebration. It doesn't have to be a conference or anything formal, but just begin to explore across the nation. Are there opportunities for kickbacks, coming together, just to see if there's genuine interest in here? Because there's one thing to sort of play around in the technological boxes, but it's another thing to sort of get dressed, go to a location, go into your pocket, into your wallet, spend some money on the experience, and to then have sort of human to human interaction with people. And so the people who are on the fringe wanting to stir things up, they're likely not to come into that environment. So you might find yourself among a community of people who aren't looking to tear away from monoracial Blackness. They're just simply looking to evolve, understand, and have opportunities for intra-group kind of interaction, that are where the initial invitation, not of exclusivity, but the invitation is around a common heritage, identity, and similar stories. Out of that, you'll see new ideal formation. You'll see informality bridge into formality. You'll see next kinds of conversations that aren't as emotional and aren't as intense, and perhaps are even intergenerational, where you have people of my generation who are, interested in the conversation. You'll have people of someone of your generation. And then you'll even have sort of interracial families who are looking to understand and become a part of a community that is a potential role modeling source for their children who are biracial. So the value piece, I don't know. I think that'll come down the road a bit. The first step is sort of the weeding out of those who are really wanting to formulate something and thinking strategically about all the minefields, all the potential threats, and all the opportunities. And then how does that happen organically with a little bit of structure? With a little bit of structure. All right. So that's my musing on it. Yes, we want people to be more inclusive to us as we are biracial. All right. One sec. All right, we got toenail breaker in here. The question is about a sticky like tar. Yeah. Toenail breaker. I don't know if you saw me trying to avoid it, while also respecting the question. Shout out to Toenail Breaker. At one point, I think Toenail was one kind of educated me on the U.S. Census and the mulatto designation, so I appreciate that. All right, so expansion of Black studies to do significant research. If we are to understand the dynamics that are going on in this emerging, growing population, it has to be studied. It has to be studied. As I look around on the the YouTube channels and whatnot, and I look in sort of the academic spaces, there are growing percentages, numbers of articles that are specifically dealing with the biracial configuration. The 2000 census, two or more races in a more formidable kind of way, now allows you to extrapolate data and to tell the story of two or more races in context of Blackness, in context of homogeneity communities. And so now you can begin to know something about the community from which you come. That also gives you an indicator of where you are healthy as a group, where you have areas that need improvement, and things that are sort of on par with the data sets across other variables and other communities. And it tells you something. And when you learn where you are successful, well, you applaud that, and then you want to replicate that, particularly if you're a parent. If you can understand what's working for biracial young people, you want to replicate that as much as you can in your home and in your institutions. If you're seeing data set that is problematically representing two or more races, then you become solution oriented. And perhaps to your point, Magic Mulata, solution oriented is action, right? You understand there's a problematic data set. We want to solve that. We want to move the bar on that a little bit. And so we then strategize and we implement a solution to help improve the problem or the statistical measurement of the problem. We want it to move towards the positive. That becomes action item. Cultures need action. They need the ability to do something. It can't just talk to each other and at each other. They need to accomplish something, because accomplishment builds pride. Pride builds memories, and pride builds shared collective identity. And so understanding through research across a number of variables to be able to tell your story gives you an opportunity for pride, but also action, which is critically important for a particular cultural community's formation. All right. Biracial people need to set strong boundaries. That's what we need to learn how to do. Yeah, all human beings do. Yeah. We need to accomplish things together, yes, for ourselves. All right. So to the part about accomplishing things together, yes. If you're looking at a data set, and it'll largely probably be something in the identity formation of young people, and you see certain trends or certain issues that seem to be poignantly focused in or targeted towards biracial communities or two or more races, you then can strategize. Your academicians, are typically going to tell statistical stories, but it's the individual and groups that then seek to implement solution and to solve the problem. Some of that can be at a local level, that can be at a familial level, some of that can be at an individual level, but it can also be at a political level. But in order to appropriately lobby and legislate on behalf of a given community to improve a condition, you need to know something about it. And so, where can we do that more formidably? I'm recommending the expansion and breadth build out of Black Studies programs. All right. Parent awareness, y'all. Parent awareness. Parents need to realize that they have their own sense of worldview. They came together as a couple for whatever reasons. Hopefully, that's rooted in love and longevity. But they produced a child that does not have the cultural homogeneity that they have, the whole cultural specificity that they have two or more races in them, and that inside and outside the home, they have to navigate public spaces, they have to navigate social circles. And as more and more numbers come up, what is parents' awareness about proximity, about opportunities to have your children connected to people that represent both the cultural communities, a parent's sophistication, and just not just thinking provision, safety, fun, education, right? But there has to be a sort of an awareness, a broader awareness about the journey of biracial kids in a modern era, especially when they come out of isolated, very small numbers, and now they're a part of broader communities. What can parents do to form parent groups among their peers or other individuals in similar situations so that their children can have, depending on their age, play circles, healthy social circles. They can have a nice mix of different kind of friends, but you can also be aware that it is typically in social formation. It is typically in groups outside the house where tension occurs, where a gatekeeping dynamic kind of occurs, and your beautiful son and or daughter has to navigate that, right? What is the vocabulary? What is the push pull? When do you bring in different figures to help complement what you're trying to accomplish, to provide support? Parents have to have a heightened awareness about the journey that biracial kids go through, especially when they're in esteem formation. They're developing a sense of confidence, a sense of belonging, and a sense of self. If 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 you're not attentive to this and you just let the winds kind of move your child wherever you may, they're likely going to be strong enough and resilient to come out of that. But it can also be a time where they don't quite fit anywhere. They don't quite fit anywhere. And if you don't fit anywhere, you can possibly succumb to anything, and can be easily influenced. And so there's an extra amount of time at the age set, typically around 5 to 12 years old, where you really, really, really want to have systematic ways in which you're checking in with your beautiful seeds around how they're feeling about themselves, how they're managing the beauty of their two or more heritages, and how that is affecting them in positive, healthy kinds of ways. So parent awareness. All right, let me pause there, see what we got in the chat. Appreciate y'all coming in. All right. If you all have some thoughts about what a growing percentage of black, white kids, biracial kids are, the aggregate of the population of those who are two or more races is 18% for black, white mix. But if you look at those under 1 year old, it's 36%. That means the growth is going to increase. And the largest young group of biracial configuration is black and white. Much of America's dialogue in the racial space has historically been black and white, but it's been an assumption of monoracial blackness to include biracial kids, multi-generational kids, and the broader white society. Now we have an intra-group nuance where there's dialogue and tension points within a historical black monoracialness, where biracial kids are now asserting and asking questions and pushing back in ways that were unfamiliar to me. As I mentioned, I'm a biracial kid. At 16, I decided to get out of the proverbial gray of biraciality and land into a blackness. And then when I turned 54, I discovered there's a community of people saying, hey, we need to rethink this thing, right? And so it's fascinating to me, and kind of why I'm in this space. But ultimately, is to provide tools for parents who are parenting black and biracial kids. The colorism conversation, y'all, the colorism conversation, that is already happening. To me, the stability of the collective black community is tied to this conversation. If you look at much of the frustration and perhaps even in some instances, high frustration that's coming from biracial beautiful people is in the space of how they are felt, how they are received, how they are embraced, how they are welcomed, or how none of the above is actually applying. And a lot of times when they are sort of addressed, and this is happening in both ways, it's around phenotype, and it's around color, and it's around aesthetic, and it's around appearances. And so we have this historical group that had been, for the most part, bonded to each other. One could debate that, who are now becoming more and more in a internal civil war. And I'm losing that a little bit, using that a little bit facetiously, but there's this infighting, there's this dynamic that is occurring, and it's largely rooted in the obvious. And in many instances, the obvious is color. If we're going to have a conversation, let's be mindful of what is the end goal. What is the end goal? Because that might shape our conversations. Is the end goal for a rigid rip tearing apart? I know that's being a little bit dramatic. Or is the goal for a sort of a celebratorial acknowledgement of a maternal home, but in a new nuance of an intraculture that is now emerging? I don't know where it'll be in another generation from now, but how does this newness, how does this acknowledgement, how does this birthing process occur in a way that maintains some level of harmony? Right now, I see much of the dialogue and the push-pull and the banter between young people. We need three generations in the conversation, y'all. We need generations, and we need three generations of biracial people. We need three generations of monoracially Black people who are having a conversation about what does this mean. If you are like me, born in 1968, where the earliest data set was 1970, 1% of the population was considered biracial, it was not enough to even make a noise. We just kind of either isolated, or we fit in, or we kept perpetually trying to fit in, or we found other primary identities. Fortunately for my era, there was a pathway into Blackness. I never felt a pathway into whiteness. I always realized I could be outgrouped largely based upon my phenotype rooted around my hair at the time. Yeah, I had me an afro. It was nice little afro, little shag. But Blackness, as long as you could sort of hold your own, you could find a cultural home. And that is my life lived. However, as the numbers begin to swell and to grow, the potential for in-group tension is also potentially going to grow. We need three generations of conversation, because the younger you are, feel free to critique this, the more impulsivity is in place, the more your reputation, at least on the forefront, is prominent, the more currency respect has, and the fact that not all but a significant part of playing out in relative anonymity, where people don't know each other, we can say some things that we possibly can't unsay. We can say some things that we possibly will not be able to unsay. And so we need some reason, we need some in-person kind of conversation, and we need some insight. We need a presence of some wisdom, some elders, some middle elders, and some young people who can have their voice and their issues heard, but we can come to some kind of harmonious consensus of how we're going to move forward. How we're going to move forward. It's an infinite game. It's all about growth and progress as a community, and that's never ending. Yes, it's going to be ongoing. But I will say this, it is changing. The conversation around biracialness in my era is vastly different than the conversation around biracialness today. And that's because the demographics are changing. There's different platforms for people to express themselves and to be heard. And there's many different kind of moving parts. We have to acknowledge that change is coming, but a part of our conversation is what does it look like? And on the back end, will we still be sort of a broad cultural community with a common interest and connection to the work of ancestors and elders, or are we talking about becoming something completely different and in potential adversarial relationship with a historical Black maternal home? I hope not. I hope it's the prior, that we're thinking through the immersion of an intra-group, INTRA, which means within, a new emerging group within a broader macro Blackness, and how does that move forward? All right. Mulatto says we all need the generations being heard. Yep. All right. So this is my last point I want to see if there's any questions or conversations if you have, or anyone who wants to come on, come on and expound a little bit. But intra-group shifts. This is already happening, y'all. Intra-group, within group shifts. Okay? Intra means within. There are already a momentum that is upon us where people are having dialogue, they're having self-declarations, they're making choices, they're making decisions about how they live their life and how they raise their children. And they're rejecting ways of old. They're rejecting historical explanations, particularly like the one drop rule. They're rejecting a pathway to culture that requires the silencing of one parent over the other. They're rejecting sort of this consensus head nodding as to what the broad agenda ought to be. They're seeking to have their input and their voice. In many instances, they're re-articulating and reasserting and reaffirming their historical role in Black plight and progress. There's a shift. There is increasingly a shift. This shift is manifesting itself in challenging historical mono ideology, how one prays, how one votes, how one looks at modern subject matter in the space of conservatism or liberalism. These are new voices that are coming out. There's been no other time, I would think, in the next 5 or 10 years where we have opportunities to formally, particularly through Black studies and conferences, to talk, to dialogue, and to think ahead about these times before major incidents, major tension between Black folk and biracial folk sort of hit the stage. And we have an opportunity to turn a corner in a way that includes the complexity of new identity formation. It acknowledges the historical role. It acknowledges the beauty in Blackness, but it also acknowledges in the beauty of biracialness. And also, how does it account for this undeniably growing community that in many instances wants a connection to an historical Black experience, but for whatever reason, in the fray, in the grass, in the weeds, are having challenges, are having some dynamics that are perplexing and complex. There's a shift. How do we get in front of it? I don't know where that ultimate formation or conversation occurs. I hope our academics will lead some of that. I hope some of the leadership in some of these community dialogue spaces will begin to ask some of these questions. And I hope that leadership within the Black community, or young thinkers and influencers and charismatic folks and people who are concerned about the next 5 or 10 years in terms of the robustness, healthiness of the collective Black community, are thinking in ways that are not isolating but inclusive of biracial communities. And I would say the same, that biracial voices, as you rise and get louder and have your issues heard in more prominent ways, that you also take some time to include, to approach, to conversate, to dialogue with, to seek to understand where this tension point is with historically your Black monoracial community and circles, and that we're seeking to acknowledge, but to not fray, to not destroy, to not simply replicate rhetoric and thinking that's very reminiscent of historical white supremacy, that we're very cautious in our vocabulary, in our language, in our conversations, in our writings, in our YouTubing, in a way that says, hey, I understand cultural mama, but we are of a new generation, and these are our issues and our realities. Some of that is in response to how we have been treated in the monoracial. Some of it is beyond the monoracial. But as we move forward, we want to do that in an intra-group kind of way, with our own distinction, with our own uniqueness, but at the same time acknowledging that we are the current representation of the beautiful work of ancestors elders, and lived love sources who have our best interests in heart. We're going to have a conversation. So we need to continue. All right, let me see. I just want the black community to respect our identity as mixed race and not get offended if claim being mixed race think we hate our blackness. Yeah, yeah. But how do we say that? I just want the black community to respect our identity as mixed race and not get offended if claiming mixed race and think we hate our blackness. How do we say that? What is the conversation like? What do the words look like? Right? I acknowledge that I am from a cultural mother rooted in that blackness. Prior to that and prior to the arrival of the United States has an African context to that. I recognize that I have some great grandfolk that were black and lived in the United States and on the continent. I acknowledge that. But I also have to acknowledge my beautiful mother. I also got to acknowledge my beautiful dad and his people and where they come from. And so I am of blackness and I am of whatever the other cultural community is. But in that ofness, in that duality, in that beautiful intersection, I am mixed. I am biracial. I have love for my cultural mother and I have love for my cultural father. I have love for my literal mother. And of course, I have love for my literal father. What's next, right? How do we acknowledge that we're not criticizing or critiquing or blaming? You can acknowledge incidents. You can point out injustices or unfair treatment, but anchor yourself in your words, in your breath, in your writing, in your spirit, in your essence, in your metaphysics. Essence yourself in acknowledging love of the communal heritage that you come from, and then state your identity in specific terms. It's how we do it. It's how we do it that'll determine the intra continuity that we're currently working through. All right. I'm musing here. I'm philosophizing. I'm improvising. Mulatto Prince, how you doing, brother? I don't think I ever seen you on the platform. Trying to be one will cause us to be divided into different languages. Trying to be one. So intra group, I'm assuming, will cause us to be divided into different languages. Huh. Brother, I'm not fully understanding that statement. If you wanted to share a little bit more, I'll definitely. Well, you have another one here. Hold on. We don't find the words. The words are simple. We're mixed, not black. Black has always been black. Yeah. That is a true statement, but the way I phrased it is also a true statement, right? Which one do you choose, I guess, right? Is it tact or is it direct? And I think that's personality based or whatever the moment and timing causes. But if there's an adversarial relationship, yeah, then you're more poignant and concise in your words. But if you're looking to just simply acknowledge a newness, a beauty within your family structure, what is the language and tone and vocabulary that can say that in a way that is not a turning away or against? It's just embracing something anew, because the timing and the circumstances and the realities and the numbers are just simply warranting it. All right. Mixed is new, accept the new. It's all language, brother. It's all language. All right. So I'm gonna stay on here for a couple more minutes, see if there's any other comments. I'm getting ready to wrap up. J4 Conversation does some things in the biracial space, does some things in the parenting space. And so if you find value in that, thank you so much. Would love to have you formally join the community by liking the YouTube and subscription if you're so inclined. It will happen naturally. Yeah. Mulatto Prince is right. It will happen naturally. But if we want to influence how it happens, then continue the way you guys are. You're having conversations with each other. Some of you are trying to elevate the conversation to more organized kind of ways, and all that will happen in due time. You may attempt to do this in formal kind of ways and take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, but that's just the nature of group formation. But the one thing that is undeniable, if you get a certain number or a certain percentage of a group that identifies a common way, and they find a way to come together to express their commonality, that leads to a community. And the precursor to a culture is a community. The numbers would suggest that you're moving in that direction. I don't know if it'll look like a definitive culture that you might see today in first indigenous people, Latino, Black, whatever the case may be, but it will look something different than what it looks right now. The word blossom as we grow into our identity. I feel you on that. See there, mulatto, blossom, right? That's a transitional word. That's an embracing word. Love your content and conversation. Very on point. Thanks for being aware of what's going on with us. Yeah. As I said, Magic Mulatto, at 16, I became Black, and at 54, I discovered there was a biracial option. Beautiful. We have community, no doubt. No doubt. All right, family. I don't see any other comments in here. Appreciate y'all riding with me for a little bit on a Monday. Again, if you're interested in the content, please check out the next video and feel free to join the community. Take care, everybody. Great point, Mulatto. Prince. I think biracial people are similar to Native Americans. Our origins start here in America. Yeah. Yeah, I feel you on that. Although in my own psychology, I connect myself elders, ancestors, and at some point the ancestors predate America. And there's a lot of currency when you can feel as if you're a current representation of that continuum that extends beyond America. Because if you begin in America, then much of that identity has to formulate in chattel enslavement or some form of hyper segregation and racism. Psychologically, I prefer to have an idealistic cultural home that predates the chattel superior inferior relationship within the United States. I think you can land in the same identity, but what is the thinking and the nuance? Why do you psychologically want to start in the United States versus acknowledging, a continental grandparent on both sides of the relationship, right? So, like, my mother's from France, my dad is from New Orleans with a Dominican influence and an African influence. If I can see myself and gain some power and sense of self from my father's African ancestry and take that with me and have a sense of momentous kind of identity, I can also do that for my mother's French identity. My mother's father is from Algeria. He's a Muslim cat from Algeria. If I am so bold enough, I could then also associate myself with Northern Africa and take a certain cultural historical cachet with me in a current place. And so I can understand, the Native Americans are origin, they start here in America, but if we are the current representation of our parents, I think it's healthy to acknowledge the obvious that our parents had parents, had parents, had parents, had parents. And so our identity in all of its duality is the manifestation of generations. And there's a certain kind of power and certain kind of internal fortitude you can get just through psychological association with continents rather than oppressive experiences in the U.S. My thoughts. Yeah, I was about to get off, and then Mulatto Prince had something in there. Our lines split, and we can be both from both places at the same time. Europe, Africa, our existence period within these two lines. Yeah, they were very well said. Very well said. All right, I'm gonna get. All right, y'all. J4 Conversations.